I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon. I confess to God the Almighty, and to you, my brothers and my sisters, I have sinned by my own fault, in my thoughts and in my words, in the deeds that I have done and in what I have failed to do, I have sinned. Now I ask you, all of my brothers and my sisters, pray for me. And we had started in Genesis, and we had gotten up to a certain point, and then I'd stopped. Now we're going to pick up basically from there. So the place where we're picking up is after the death of Isaac, and after Jacob has returned from, remember, he had run away from his brother Esau. He lived with his uncle Laban, who kind of took advantage of him, and then he left. By the time he left, some years later, he had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and already the beginning of a passel of children. And he reconciles with Esau, has returned to the land he came from. We discover in a story about we only know about one daughter. He obviously had a bunch more kids than that, but we only knew about one daughter. Her name is Dinah. And her story reveals a bunch of stuff, including the fact that his 2 oldest boys are psychopaths. I should mention to you, if you are smart, to go back, scroll back, and find the sermon, like the one about Dinah, and go ahead and rewatch that. You won't remember it because it was a year ago, at least. So this is kind of where the story begins, and what has happened is yet another child has been born to Jacob. Jacob, by the way, is also called Israel. So he's now rocking 2 different names, Jacob or Israel. And he's got a son now. His name is Joseph. And when Joseph was 17, he was pasturing the flock along with his brothers, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. These are 2 of his father's concubines. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. And it just so happened that Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than all the other sons because Joseph was the son of his old age. So he made for him a multicolored tunic. And his brothers, seeing that their father loved Joseph more than the rest, hated him and could not even speak on friendly terms with him. Then Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers. And they hated him even more, because this was the dream. He said, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves in the field, and my sheaf rose and stood up straight, and your sheaves, well, they gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." And the brothers said to him, "Are you actually think you're going to reign over us? Are you going to rule us?" Yeah, they hated him even more now because of the dreams. And then he had another one, and he told it to his brothers. "Look, I had another dream. This time I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars, and they were bowing down to me." And he shared this with his brothers and his father, and it was his father who rebuked him and said, "What are you dreaming? Is it that I and your mother, along with your brothers, shall bow down before you, bowing ourselves to the ground?" And his brothers were jealous. His father let it go. So, one day, his brothers were pasturing their father's flock out in Shechem. And Israel, that is Jacob, said to Joseph, "Your brothers are out pasturing the flock in Shechem, so I will send you to them." And Joseph said, "Sure, I'll go." And he said, "Now, see about their welfare and see how the flock is doing, and then bring me a report." So Jacob sent Joseph from the valley of Hebron, where they were staying, and Joseph came to Shechem, but he didn't find his brothers. Instead, as he was just wandering around in a field, some stranger said to him, "Are you lost? What are you looking for?" And he said, well, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock. And the man said, oh, they moved on from here. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph then went to Dothan after his brothers and found them there. But they saw him coming. And while he was still a ways off, they began to plot against him to murder him, saying to one another, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him. Let's throw the body into a pit, and we'll say a wild beast devoured him, and then we'll see what becomes of these dreams. Reuben heard this and sought to rescue Joseph from their hands. He said, oh, let's not take his life. We shouldn't shed any blood, so we can just throw him into the pit because it's waterless, but not actually lay hands on him ourselves. Now, he said this because he was thinking about rescuing Joseph later so he could bring him back to their father. Now, when Joseph arrived, his brothers grabbed him, tore off his multicolored cloak, and then they threw him into that waterless pit that was nearby. They were sitting down to eat a meal, and they raised their eyes and looked, and behold, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites. They were coming from Gilead with camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to sell that in Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there for us if we kill our brother and cover up the murder? Instead, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites rather than laying hands on him. After all, he is our brother. He's flesh and blood. And he was persuasive. Then some Midianites passed by, and they grabbed Joseph out of the pit, and they sold him to some Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And the Ishmaelites brought Joseph to Egypt. Now, when Reuben returned to the pit and found that Joseph was not there, he tore his garments, and he went to his brothers and said, our brother's not there. As for me, where am I to go? So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the tunic in blood, and sent it to their father, saying, we found this. Examine it. Verify that it's in fact your son's tunic. And upon examination, Jacob said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. And Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for many days. And his sons and his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. And he wept. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the guard. So I want to remind you that the story of the family here is a dysfunctional story. It's like people playing favorites in politics. All the way back to Abraham, who has two sons, right? It's Ishmael, and then his son Isaac. And as soon as Isaac is old enough that he survived, it's at the weaning party, so that would make Isaac about 2 or 3 years old. Apparently he's not going to die in childhood. Then Sarah's like, get rid of that other one. I don't want him around. So here's this, 8-year-old kid being chased away along with his mother. Next generation is Isaac. He marries Rebecca, and it's all lovely and good. But they have twins. And she plays favorite, and he plays favorites. And he likes the hairy one, whose name is Esau. And because Esau's really manly, and she likes the other son, whose name is Jacob. And so now there's more of that dysfunctional conflict, which leads to this terrible split between the two brothers. And then Jacob ends up having to flee, and it's years before he can come back and reconcile with his brother. But nobody's learned the lesson, because Jacob marries 2 women, and he plays favorites, right? And so now there's all kinds of conflict, because the 2 oldest boys are sons of the other wife, Leah. the one with the pretty eyes. But Rachel, that's the one who Dad likes. So they're already absorbing Mom's frustration and feelings of hurt and alienation. And it turns out these guys turn into really psychotic maniacs. Because, and that's the story of Dinah is where we discover that. So go back and catch that sermon again or read the story. They are psychotic maniacs. And then when Joseph is born, more playing favorites. Oh, my favorite son, the son of my old age. Oh, you're my best. You're my best. I like here, have a special thing that none of the others got. And they're all furious. They're so angry, every one of them. And then Joseph, he's a teenager, so of course, he's a teenager. So he acts like a teenager. He tattles on them. He tells them the dreams. I mean, he could have had the dream, dude, but you could have kept it to yourself. But no, he had to be like, your sheaves are going to bow down to me. And so, I can understand how they might not like him, but these guys are so dysfunctional, and at least two of them are psychotic and are ready to kill. And so now this famous story that I was reading, right? And here's the thing about the story. Is like, okay, who did what to whom? How was Joseph sold to the Ishmaelites who brought him to Egypt, or was he thrown in a pit where Midianites grabbed him out of the pit and brought him to Egypt? Which one is that? What's going on? So the story, which kind of tracks along pretty good, you can follow it really well, and kind of gets really messy right there. And it's like, what's going on? I can explain what's going on. So let me remind you, you've heard me say things about how, Mark's gospel is the first gospel written. It becomes the template for Luke and Matthew. So what I'm talking about, there's a fancy word for this. It's called canonical shaping, and it's the process whereby we end up with the Bible we have. And so part of that process is that the book of Genesis starts out with two completely separate stories that get brought together, two versions. And you can actually divide them up pretty easily. Nowadays, people use a computer, but you don't need to do that. You can use a colored marker, because all you have to do is look for any story where you see the name of God as God, right? So Genesis 1, God created. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and that's called the E. That's the E source, or the E book. That comes from E. There's this book, apparently a scroll. They call it E, because Elohim, that's the word for God, starts with an E. And then that, by the way, that first chunk, all the way through the chapter 2, verse 4, I think it is, and then it switches, and this is the account of how the Lord created the heavens and the earth. So when you're looking in your English Bibles, you see Lord, it's all in capital letters. It's small caps, but they're all capitalized. Why? Because behind that is the name of God, which comes to us in a really terrible mispronunciation, Jehovah. That's not actually it's not even close, but we're used to saying Jehovah, so we just go, that's where they call God Jehovah, so it's called J. So here's the stuff where God's called God, E. Here's the stuff where God's called Jehovah, J. Simple as that. Now, most of the time, that's just interesting. But here, it's actually helpful. So you have this right on the back of your bulletin, and you have two versions of this. You can read along if you want, but I'm just going to read it to you. This is a quick pull apart. I'm sure that a good scholar would go, well, that piece actually goes over on the other side. But here, listen to these. So here's one version. When they saw Joseph from a distance, but before he arrived, they plotted against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But Reuben heard this and wanted to rescue him and said, let us not take his life. He said, shed no blood. Let's throw him into this waterless pit here in the wilderness, but not lay hands on him. Reuben was planning to rescue him later and to bring him to his father. So when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, that varicolored tunic that he wore, and threw him into the pit. However, some Midianite traders passed by, and they pulled Joseph out of the pit and took him by force into Egypt. Now when Reuben returned and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his garments, and he found his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" Now here's the other version, which I'm calling Judah's account. They were sitting down eating a meal when they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The caravan was heading down to Egypt with camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Instead, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. It's not right that we lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And the brothers listened, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And the Ishmaelites brought Joseph into Egypt. Okay, so you have these two versions, and here's what you see. In each version, you have a brother trying to save Joseph. Now, I know a few people I know a couple of criminal defense attorneys and one DA. And I know that if I were to share those stories with them, they'd go, "Oh yeah." Because each guy is saying, "Well, yeah, but sure, we committed the crime, but I was I was just in the car outside. I didn't rob the bank. In fact, I wasn't even the driver. I just happened to be there in the car. I wanted to make sure that nothing bad happened because they're my brothers, but I didn't commit the crime." That's what they're saying. In other words, they're saying, "I'm not the one to blame." And so each version of the story has one of them trying to rescue his brother. And so one version of the story is, "I tried to save him. I said, well, let's just throw him in this pit. I was going to come back and get him later. But then some wandering band of Midianites came along, and they kidnapped him from the pit, and they took him to Egypt." And the other version of the story, "Oh, man, the brothers, they all wanted to kill him, and I wanted to save him, but some Ishmaelites came along, and they're our cousins." Remember, Ishmael they all have the same great-grandfather, right? The Ishmaelites, and then these folks who would be considered Israelites, the sons of Israel, they all have the same great-grandfather. That's Abraham. So this is a related kinship group. He's like, they're gonna. If they make a slave of one of ours, that's still kin. They're gonna treat him okay, and he'll be alive. And they paid us 20 shekels, which, by the way, was the going rate in like the 17th century BC. So it gives you an idea of when this is occurring. What you have is these two guys telling the story, but trying to do it in a way that makes them look not so bad. But what are they agreeing on? We wanted to kill him, and instead of killing him, he ended up in Egypt as a slave. Now, this story gets passed on from generation to generation, and it's preserved because everybody knows the story of Joseph and how he ends up there. But within at least two of these families, they were like, "Is it true that our eponymous ancestor, our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather tried to kill Joseph?" "Oh, no. Our eponymous ancestor, Judah, he tried to save his life by suggesting they sell him to some neighbors as a slave." Or, "Is it true that our eponymous ancestor, our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Rueben, was part of this plot to kill Joseph?" "No, he tried to save him by putting him in a pit. He was going to come back and rescue him later. But then this wandering band of nomads came by, and they just kidnapped Joseph and brought him to Egypt." So you have these two stories, these two attempts to not sound too guilty, but they both agree Joseph ends up a slave in Egypt. Isn't that interesting? Now, see, to me, I don't. Some people are like they do biblical gymnastics to try to bring these two stories together and resolve the contradiction. Somehow the Midianites are really the Ishmaelites, and somehow this, that, which you can't actually do. And I just go, cool. I have two independent witnesses that say, yeah, he ends up a slave in Egypt. Not one, not the book of Genesis, but two. This story, the E story, and the other story, the J story. I have two witnesses that confirm the same basic facts, and they're so busy trying to exonerate themselves in the process that you know it's real. And so I feel good about that, because there's no historical evidence that I'm aware of that's been found by any archaeologist or anybody to say that this story, that they can find it, some in the Mideast, like, oh, look, we found this thing that talks about Joseph. It doesn't exist. At least hasn't been found if it does. So I read it and I'm like, oh, but still, yeah, you don't make up a story like that. That's the real deal. That's the truth. I mean, they're lying so hard to make themselves look good that we know this Joseph guy was real. The plot was real. Isn't that cool? Now, to me, that's super interesting. And I read that and I break that apart and I resolve the conflict and I feel really good. And then I look at the story again and I go, oh, wait. Here are these two guys, Reuben and Judah, they're the hero of their stories, and yet they didn't stand up to their brothers. They didn't say, no. They didn't say, you guys are nuts. I'm going to go rescue him before he gets here. They didn't. They caved. They well, why don't we do this instead? They tried to convince their brothers to do differently, but they didn't just say, that's wrong, cut it out, what's the matter with you? Slap, like in the movie. Right? They didn't do any of that. They had the chance to do what was right. They didn't do it. They had the chance to speak out. They didn't speak out. They went along. I don't want you guys to hate me too. They didn't want it to turn on them, so they just kind of went along. They tried to manipulate things to the best, I did my best. But they didn't. It was pretty wishy-washy. Right? And I look at that, and I suddenly, it stops looking like a story about a dysfunctional family some 3,700 years ago. And it starts looking a lot more like a mirror. Like, how many times have I been the one that's been wishy-washy, who I just haven't stood up for what is right and said, that's right or that's wrong, don't do it. Or I'm not going to be a part of it. How many times have I caved to the pressure? How many times, we're praying the prayer, right? Because we think of sin all the times, of all the bad stuff we do, but we prayed the prayer, right? In the things that I have done and in what I have failed to do, I have sinned. We just got done with that. Yeah. And I suddenly look at that and I go, okay, I may be pleading to the lesser offense, but I'm still part of the crime. And so the question becomes, what grace can save me from that? What kindness, what love, what measure of mercy can save me from what I really do, not from the stories I tell myself, not for the excuses I give myself. The story of Joseph is the story of the powerful grace of God. And the story of our Christian faith is the ultimate story of God's grace through the cross. The final and complete healing for our problem. Can you find now the prayer of response? We're going to pray that together. I make excuses for my actions and justify my choices, but these are just what they seem, rationalizations. The truth that I don't want to face is very simple. I have chosen to say nothing in the time for speaking out, to do nothing in the time for bold action, to oppose nothing in the time for standing firm. I have surrendered to temptation, yielded to gratification, caved to pressure. In what I have done and in what I have failed to do, I have sinned. And no story I tell, no excuse I devise, no explanation I offer will change it. Only a mighty redemption, only a love beyond measure can save me. So save me, Lord Jesus. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for in-person worship Sunday morning at 8:30 at Christ United Methodist, or Sunday morning at 10:15 at Stanton United Methodist. And if Sunday morning is not your jam, join us Monday night, 6 o'clock at Christ United Methodist for Pizza Church. It's church, and then we eat pizza. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
Perfect peace. Oh, may God keep you in